Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamry, and I'm the president of CSIS. I'm here to really just welcome. My role here is ornamental only, and it's simply to welcome you all and say a sincere thank you to Congressman Ami Bera, who is going to be our keynoter today. The topic we're going to discuss, we've got a wonderful panel to review this, is what's called march-in rights. March-in rights is a curious term, but it's a term that relates to one of the most foundational acts that Congress passed about 40 years ago called the Bayh-Dole Act. But the Biotechnology Act is the reason that we all got vaccines within a year after COVID hit. It was because Bayh-Dole made it the law of the land where technology developed in government laboratories or in government-funded research must be commercialized, must be brought to the market. And within the Bayh-Dole Act, there's a very small provision that's called the march-in rights. The original purpose of march-in rights was to say if a company bought the legal rights to an invention and then just wanted to sit on it because they were trying to protect some other product they had, the government could come in and to reclaim those rights and give it to another competitor. It was to make sure products got to the market. But now it's being interpreted in different ways, and we want to discuss that. We're very fortunate today to have Congressman Ami Bera with us. He's a medical doctor by training. But he's also now a member of Congress. He's a distinguished member of Congress that's been serving in high-level committees throughout the Congress and really pioneering a modern America, an America that embraces technology, embraces the future, and adapts public policy to accommodate that. I've seen him lead in so many different ways, and today he's going to lead us in this conversation about Bayh-Dole and march-in rights. Congressman Bera, it's such a privilege to have you with us. Let me turn to you, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Hamry, thank you for that generous introduction and, for all the work that CSIS does. Obviously, I've had the pleasure of sitting on some of your panels and working groups and continue to really appreciate the work that you're doing. And this is obviously a very timely topic. As we think about the pandemic and can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, Dr. Hamry touched on, could you ask me 12, 14 months ago, or ask most of the medical professionals and the smart people out there if we'd have a vaccine to defeat COVID-19. Most of us were saying 16, 18 months at the earliest, more likely 24 months, and let's hunker down and get this. But the truth is we have 3 incredibly safe and effective vaccines within less than 12 months. And much of the public probably thinks, well, they started working on these vaccines at the outset of the pandemic. The truth is, for the mRNA technology, this is something that the federal government, the NIH, has been investing in for years. And the return on that investment is that we have these remarkable vaccines that will help us end this pandemic. And in truth, if we look at our history in the latter half of the 20th century, it was the investments that we were making in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in our academic institutions, our great research institutions, in the NIH, in the NSF and elsewhere. And these are investments only the federal government can make because you're thinking about ideas and research that you don't know what that return on investment is going to be. We don't have to guess what that return on investment was because we saw all the industries that came out of all of this R&D. We built the pharmaceutical industry, cures for cancer, helping us manage, chronic diseases, but also developing the internet, developing all this digital technology, et cetera. That all came from federal investment, but in partnership with the private sector, in partnership with academia. And it's hugely important for us to protect those federal investments. And that's why this topic is so important, because we're seeing a renewed debate over what those investments will be like in the context of what truly is a great power competition with China and others. And if we look at, investment in R&D as a percentage of GDP, where we used to be the top in the world, we now rank, much lower than that. And China is top in the world, I think, spending close to 2% of their GDP on research and investment. And the panel will correct me, but I think ours is now shrunk to about 0.7% of GDP. Whereas again, in the 50s and 60s, we were probably closer to that 2% GDP number. The reason why this is so important is when we think about issues of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, et cetera, whoever discovers and creates these industries is going to have a huge advantage as they go forward in the 21st century. So, I'm grateful that the Senate is having a debate as we speak right now on these investments in R&D. We're having a similar debate, and we've seen, in President Biden's budget and some of the requests that are coming to the House of Representatives, a desire to increase research and development funding in these areas. Now, the second piece of why innovation is so important is also protecting these patents. And that's where you're seeing the Marching rights start to come in. Obviously, I understand the debate that will take place over some of these TRIPS waivers with regards to the mRNA vaccines and the technology that is uniquely American technology. I think we have to be very careful that we limit that debate to the pandemic. And as opposed to, there are some members of Congress who want to take these Marching rights to everything, to all pharmaceuticals, et cetera. I think that would kill some of our innovative edge, as well as some very important industries to the United States. And I think that would set a dangerous precedent. On the vaccine side of things, I also think we have to approach this with caution. In truth, it's not going to be very easy to build and develop the manufacturing capacity for mRNA vaccines. There are other vaccines out there that you certainly could license, much as the AstraZeneca vaccine's been licensed to the Serum Institute in India and elsewhere. That could help us ramp up manufacturing capacity. I also think Pfizer and Moderna could partner with other companies like Merck and others that have some vaccine through licensing agreements, et cetera, to help ramp up manufacturing to the extent possible. So I think that debate's still going to take place, but I would say with regards to the pandemic and vaccines, let's keep that debate very narrow, and let's be very careful that these Marching rights don't extend to so many other areas in industry. And with that, Dr. Hamre, folks aren't here to listen to me. Let me kick it back over to you so they can learn from the panel.
Well, I think, Congressman, we heard exactly what we needed to hear from you, which was a thoughtful, wise comment about the importance of intellectual property being a foundation for America's prosperity. And I want to say thank you. All members of Congress are elected to represent a region, but also be a national leader. Very few of them are national leaders, but you are. Thank you for what you've been doing, Congressman.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, let me turn to you, Walt. Walt, you've got a panel of wonderful experts, and you're going to be leading a conversation that's going to amplify on the things we just heard from Congressman Bera. Why don't you take it from here?
Dr. Hamre, John, thanks so much for the kind introduction, and thank you to CSIS for hosting this important and timely session today. Congressman Bera, thanks so much for your work for the nation and for your state, and the work, especially with the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and also for sharing those important perspectives today. The drivers of our national innovation capacity, the importance of intellectual property rights, and the opportunities that we face as a nation, and also the risks to America's future. The Bayh-Dole Act has played an essential role for the last 40 years and has served as a key enabler in the response, as we know, to the COVID-19 pandemic. The US is in unprecedented competition globally, and this is visible in all fields of science and technology. We see it in standards, throughout the supply chain, and all that affects our economic and national security. The new domains of warfare are visible in cyber attacks throughout our interconnected world, with the potential to affect every American. The strength of the US innovation system is essential to our competitiveness, our economic and national security. As Vannevar Bush emphasized in his 1945 report entitled Science, the Endless Frontier, the nation's investment in scientific research and in the science and technology infrastructure would be essential to post-war recovery and competitiveness. And over the past 76 years now, federally funded research has delivered the seed corn of American innovation. It has been a key to economic and strategic competitiveness today, and that competitiveness is at risk at this time. I'm so grateful to CSIS for sponsoring the Renewing American Innovation Project, through which we bring together an outstanding set of panelists today to discuss the status of innovation in America and the role of federally funded basic research at the nation's universities and research institutions. We'll explore how the protections afforded by intellectual property rights through the Bayh-Dole Act has contributed to countless entrepreneurial ventures resulting in innovative products. And we'll also uncover threats to US innovation and competitiveness in the future, in many cases unknowingly being advanced by activists and even members of Congress. So to help us in the conversation, I'm joined today by Dr. Barbara Snyder, the president of AAU, our association of the leading research universities in the United States. She is formerly president of Case Western Reserve University. We also have Jillian Fenton, who is currently president and chair of the board of the licensing executives, the LES USA Canada, and she's also special counsel for innovation and government collaborations at GSK Vaccines. Prior, she was leader at Emergent Biosolutions Incorporated, a major player, as we know, in the supply of the COVID-19 vaccine with industry innovators. Joseph Allen served on the US Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Birch Bayh, and he was a key player in securing the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act. And while he was at the US Department of Commerce, his office oversaw executive branch implementation of the Bayh-Dole Act and its companion legislation, the Federal Technology Transfer Acts. Dr. Stephen Sasalka is the executive officer of Autumn, the CEO of this many thousand member nonprofit that focuses on supporting and enhancing tech transfer globally. And he also oversees a cooperative partnership with the Federal Laboratory Consortium, which operates under the auspices of the National Institute of Standards and Technology and supports federal tech transfer for more than 300 federal research laboratories across the United States. I'm just delighted that you are all here and looking forward to our conversation. And so let's turn it over first to Dr. Barbara Snyder. As president of the AAU, Dr. Snyder, you represent the leading research universities of this country. Would you please describe the evolving role of the universities with respect to innovation and entrepreneurship in America and for the world? Barbara?
Sorry, unmuting myself as usual. It is great to be here with all of you and talk about the role of America's leading research universities in the innovation ecosystem. I'm so proud to represent this remarkable group of universities. The role of research universities really goes back even before the time you mentioned, Walt, the Vannevar Bush days, post-World War II. The use of innovation and technology to advance agriculture and the mechanical arts was really baked into the DNA of public land grant universities created by the Morrill Act of 1862 and then the later one in 1890, and further advanced by the Hatch Act, which created the agricultural experiment stations, and in 1914, the statute that created the Cooperative Extension Service. So this really goes back a long time. But after World War II, there was created this historic partnership between the federal government and research universities and industry. And it is really through that extraordinary partnership that we have become the world's leader in innovation. And the Bayh-Dole Act plays a huge role in really changing that whole landscape. Prior to Bayh-Dole, much of the knowledge generated by universities funded by the federal government was left to sit on the shelf because the federal government had neither the resources nor the ability to commercialize the inventions that its funding had supported. So since Bayh-Dole came along in 1980, this has given motivation, critical motivation to universities, to faculty members to take an active role in commercializing the products of federally funded research. Bayh-Dole has made possible a remarkable expansion in the commercialization of research discoveries over the last few decades. It's produced an incredible increase in patents and licenses resulting from university research. Before 1980, fewer than 250 patents were issued to universities annually. Discoveries were rarely commercialized for the public's benefit. But according to data from the Association of University Technology Managers, and thank you, Steve, in 2019 alone, US universities accounted for more than 7,000 patents, spun off nearly 1,000 startup companies, and generated over 500 new commercial products, including life-saving medicines and major technological advances. So today, many universities are really going to the next level to promote technology commercialization and entrepreneurship. They've done things like create university-led programs to fund and support early stage technology development. Universities now have incubators on their campuses, and they have programs that help train faculty and students to identify opportunities for commercialization that could emerge from their research, and also help them gain skills in entrepreneurship. The NSF-sponsored Innovation Corps, or I-Corps, as it's known, is an example of one program that is widely utilized on AAU campuses to help faculty and graduate students move federally funded research from the laboratory to the marketplace.
Barbara, thank you so much, and really appreciate the insights and the perspectives that you've shared. Clearly, it's been a transformation created by the Bayh-Dole Act, and so let's turn it over now to Gillian Fenton, who brings us a unique perspective as president and board chair of the LES. And the LES is an organization that's focused on the commerce of intellectual property globally. And Gillian, you're also working in the biopharmaceutical industry. Would you please describe the kinds of research relationships that universities and research institutes have developed with the biopharmaceutical industry, and also the role that intellectual property and licensing plays in bringing new products to people and to the marketplace? Gillian?
Thank you, Walt. I'd love to do so. So universities and research institutes are a critical part of the bioeconomy. They are the wellspring of discovery, creativity, and early innovation that downstream developers depend upon. Because of the Bayh-Dole Act, universities and research institutes are able to own patentable inventions arising from their federally funded research, enter into licensing transactions on this IP, and to set up and enable startups, high-risk entrepreneurial new companies that have nurtured many biopharma products through their early years. Larger biopharmas and multinational pharmas depend on in-licensing directly from universities or indirectly from alliances with or acquisitions of startups and early-stage biotechs. The overall timeline from discovery to market for a new human therapeutic or vaccine can typically range from 7 years to well over 20 years. All of that requires investment of over $1 billion, and all of that cost is incurred before the first dollar of revenue is earned. The biopharma industry is built of corporations, which means that each company must take their shareholders' interests into account by spending their limited financial resources wisely. Every key development decision has to be made with an understanding of the magnitude of the risks taken, the investment thesis, and the potential benefits. The proven best means for protecting investment decisions in this industry is the intellectual property system, including patents, trade secrets, know-how, trademarks, and copyrights. While this system is not perfect and too often ignores orphan diseases and diseases of poverty, it is the only system so far proven to generate both the innovation and the investment resources to tackle major intractable challenges in human health. The biotech industry and the bioeconomy were born because of the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act is what allows universities to own the inventions arising from federally funded research, patent them, and license these patents. Key players in this ecosystem include universities, research institutes, biotech startups, venture capital, and other funders, and large biotechs and pharmas who shoulder the enormous cost of late-stage clinical development and commercialization. All of these players interact through well-established types of transactions dependent on reliable, strong IP rights. The Licensing Executive Society is the professional society dedicated to the use of IP assets of all types to advance commerce, that is, to support the growth and development of the innovation economy. We represent all types of businesses on all sides of the transactions table in all innovation-driven industries. Our IUGI sector, which stands for University Industry Government Interface, specifically serves those who engage in the new technology developments and transactions enabled by the Bayh-Dole Act. Recent public statements have decried patents as barriers to collaboration among innovators and developers to address the pandemic. The LES is here to say that instead we have seen the reverse. Because of strong, predictable IP rights, the pandemic has spawned a golden age of collaborative development in the biopharma industry globally. We have seen universities, startups, and established biopharmas, as well as governments, come together more quickly and on a more massive scale than ever before. Patents are not a barrier to the development of countermeasures for this pandemic. Thanks, Walt.
Jillian, thank you so much for those insights. And Steve, let's turn it over to you now. Autumn used to be called the Association of University Technology Managers, and now you're going by the acronym Autumn. But regardless of the name, it truly convenes the community of technology transfer, and particularly tech transfer from America's academic institutions. Would you share with us the key dimensions of technology transfer as you see it, what the role of the Bayh-Dole Act is for academic technology transfer, and the impact that Bayh-Dole has made for society and the economy? Steve?
Great. Thanks, Walt. I appreciate that. So what I heard was dimensions of technology transfer, the role of the Bayh-Dole Act, and then its impact. And so let's just start at the beginning. So as you mentioned, Autumn is focused on supporting and advancing technology transfer globally. And although some of the people on this call might have heard the term technology transfer, it probably helps to actually define what that term is. And that really is the process of having this collaborative and creative endeavor to translate knowledge and research into impact, both in society and the economy. Now, again, some people might not have heard that term, or they've heard the term and didn't quite know what it meant. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that absolutely everybody on this call has been impacted positively by technology transfer. So if you were one of the many people that were wearing N95 masks, you can thank the University of Tennessee for pioneering that invention years ago. If perhaps you are somebody that suffers from seasonal allergies, you can thank Georgetown for the development and initial finding of what came to be Allegra. If you've got kids like I do that do not like getting shots, and instead want to get the flu mist intranasal dosed, you can thank the St. Louis School of Medicine, the University of Michigan. And even that Honeycrisp apple you might have had for lunch yesterday, that came from the University of Minnesota. So tech transfer exists all around us. So the question is, how does it actually evolve from all the research that Dr. Snyder talked about into the commercial products that Ms. Fenton talked about. So let's just use a little thought experiment. So let's imagine a talented researcher at a university that has been focusing her entire life on the process of virus growth. Along the way, she identifies a compound that seems to inhibit that replication of that virus. Now, she might be a very talented researcher in the field, and the institution might be top-notch, but it's not designed to fully test, produce, and sell that final product. And that's really where tech transfer fits in. So that researcher would reach out to its technology transfer office, and that office would be responsible for evaluating that invention, protecting it, often with patents, maybe copyrights or other types of intellectual property protection, and then identifying a company that is willing to invest that substantial time, energy, resources into developing that product into a final product. Now, as Dr. Snyder mentioned, there are thousands of inventions that have been developed and in just the last year. And really the question becomes, has it always been that way? And it hasn't. So as was mentioned, prior to Bayh-Dole, universities were still accomplishing some extraordinary research. The problem was a lot of times that research just withered on the vine. It never advanced out of that research lab into the marketplace. In fact, there was a term, and that was contaminated by federal funding. If an invention was funded by the federal government, companies often didn't even want to touch it. I heard the term predictability a little earlier, and that's a great term. There was not a lot of predictability in terms of how that invention could be advanced. That all changed with the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act allowed for a uniform mechanism to support federally funded research, and therefore laid a strong infrastructure for our universities to, again, continue to develop inventions, but now have a formal approach to actually commercializing those into the inventions of today. It has been groundbreaking, to say the least. And in fact, in a recent Hill article, where they looked at the past 30,000 or all 30,000 acts that were passed by Congress, the Bayh-Dole Act was found to be one of the 15 most influential acts. So simply put, Bayh-Dole has unleashed American innovation, to use a term that I believe Walter enjoys, to catalyze economic development across the United States. As we go forward, we need to continue to look forward and continue the infrastructure and predictability that the Bayh-Dole Act provided as we move forward. Back to you, Walt.
Steve, thanks so much for those perspectives and the insights into the transformative aspects of the Bayh-Dole Act, the importance of predictability and intellectual property rights, and the drive to entrepreneurship that is so much part of technology transfer today, moving higher risk, early stage technologies into the marketplace often takes a startup company to do that. And we'll come back to the importance of startups in the innovation system of the United States and globally. So now let's turn it over to Joe Allen, who guided Bayh-Dole through Congress and oversaw its implementation at the Department of Commerce. So Joe, you were there before birth. The role of a midwife, I think, is a very, very important one. But the baby has grown up to create incredible value for this nation in fields of all kinds, including the examples that Steve just shared. Having seen the situation prior to Bayh-Dole, and also having gone through the work with Senator Bayh and Senator Dole in its creation and deployment, would you describe what led to the legislation? Was it a discovery? Was it an issue? Was it a problem in the country? And what was the balance that the Bayh-Dole Act now represents, providing both incentives through intellectual property rights for innovation, as well as safeguards for the public? So describe also more about the Bayh-Dole margin rights that we heard about at the very beginning from Dr. Hamre and from Congressman Bera. What are the margin rights? When are they to be exercised? And how does this legislation then ultimately safeguard the public interest? Joe?
Well, listen, thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure, Walt, to be with you, and I very much appreciate CSIS having this, because as all the speakers have said, our system has worked spectacularly, but it's never been in greater danger today in the last 40 years. So I think it's important we go back and tell people how things work, why it's so important, and also that we've been through this experiment before. Quite simply, the reason we passed Bayh-Dole was that the public interest was not being protected before Bayh-Dole, because the necessary incentives for turning federally funded research into actually useful products have been destroyed. We had a system very much like the critics want to replicate today, where anyone could get a non-exclusive license to a federally funded invention, which meant that if anyone was foolish enough to commercialize it, the copiers could go back and piggyback on what the entrepreneur had risked, and companies are simply not going to do that. It's also important to recognize, while the government's making a sizable investment, industry's investing even more, and industry's taking a significant risk every time they commercialize a federally funded invention. These are not ready for prime time. They're more like ideas than products. So what happened was, because we developed a chasm in the pre-Bayh-Dole era, as Steve said, where companies did not want to touch anything to do with working with federal laboratories or universities, because the government could take away any resulting inventions, even if they'd only paid a very small percentage. And just to show you what the impact was, at our Bayh-Dole hearings, we found that the government had 28,000 inventions sitting on the shelf in Washington that had been taken away from the entrepreneurs, available for non-exclusive licensing. They were only licensing 4%, and even a smaller percentage were being commercialized. But what really stirred the Senate and my boss, Birch Bayh, was to find out that not a single drug had been commercialized from all the billions of dollars spent by NIH research under the previous policies, because frankly, there was just no incentive for commercialization. So Senator Bayh and Senator Dole, who worked across party lines, who didn't agree on very much, but they did agree on this, passed the Bayh-Dole Act, which decentralized technology management from Washington to those who actually are doing the research themselves. We gave them incentives and authorities for commercialization. We got Washington out of the way, and also we restored the intended incentives of the patent system. We also included march-in rights. Now, march-in rights didn't start under Bayh-Dole. They actually go all the way back to Vannevar Bush and President Kennedy in 1963. But march-in rights very simply are to make sure that if a university or it has a federal invention, that good faith efforts are being made to commercialize it. And if they've licensed somebody who's not trying to commercialize it, then the government can march in to license other parties. The law also says the government can march in if it looks like there's a national emergency and the licensee, through no fault of their own, can't produce enough product to meet that emergency. That's how march-in works. March-in rights were never intended, and the law does not allow this, to have the government come in and micromanage what the price of the resulting product could be. That theory started 20 years after we passed Bayh-Dole. Everyone who was a part of the bill, myself, Senator Bayh, the people at the universities who work with us, denounced that. But it should tell you a lot to know that the people pushing that theory are the same people who oppose Bayh-Dole and who also don't like patent rights. So that should really tell you as much as you need to know why this idea keeps coming up all the time. These are the same people we fought 40 years ago. It's also important to recognize that we didn't have a single company testify at our Bayh-Dole hearings that they wanted to work with universities, because again, there was so little trust there, and nobody even thought about working with federal laboratories in 1980. So Bayh-Dole started changing that, but it took many years after we passed the law for companies to have the assurance that in fact, universities and federal laboratories could be partners in high stakes research. And that trust was never more evident than a year ago today, almost a year ago, when our public and private sectors came together seamlessly to develop the most effective vaccines in the world in just a matter of months as opposed to years. Now, that experiment happened right before everyone's eyes. It was patent driven. There's not a single vaccine that was developed without patent rights anywhere in the world that I'm aware of. So our system is working. It's protecting the world right now. But unfortunately, there are still those who are trying to push that other view that we should, in fact, weaken Bayh-Dole by allowing the government to march in to control prices. We're having efforts now to say they're going to take away not just patent rights, but know-how from our people producing the vaccines. Now, it's kind of interesting that no one is after Russian know-how or Chinese know-how. They're after American know-how. And unfortunately, our government has apparently agreed that we're going to try to give it to them, which hopefully saner voices will prevail there. It's amazing that Brussels, Belgium is going to have to lecture us on how innovation works, because apparently we've forgotten. But we simply have to get the word out again. Our system works. It works in the cold, hard light of day. If you don't believe it, if you got a COVID vaccine, you should say thank you to the industry people and the government people that work together to do it. We simply have to protect the system. It would be a catastrophe if it falls apart. And if it does, it's our own fault. Thank you very much.
Joe, thank you so much and for giving us that historic perspective, as well as the parallels from when the initial bill was being developed to the debate that's going on even today. And so we've heard now several examples of how the federally funded research has enabled rapid response in the pandemic. And so I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Barbara Snyder. As we are coming out of the COVID pandemic now, and we're seeing the impact of the availability of therapies and increased diagnostics, what are the changes that we've seen in higher education, both in the research portfolio, as well as how universities have responded, the lessons that we've learned, and the contributions of university research to pandemic solutions? Barbara?
Well, it's a big question. And of course, there's a lot we could talk about with regard to pandemic-related impacts on universities. I want to start by, of course, mentioning the students who miss so much, more than a year of in-person education in some cases, commencement, homecoming, other really key parts of the university experience. For researchers, many of them had to shut down their research projects and then try to restart them much later. And this was challenging and cost money. The shift quickly, very quickly, to online-only instruction. The disruption for international students and scholars caused by travel bans and shutdowns all over the world. And of course, the horrific human toll to our university communities, students, faculty, staff, family members, everyone in our country lost people, and it's been really, really hard. And in the midst of all of this, of course, we've also seen the racial disparities that the pandemic has laid bare in our country. So there is at least a little silver lining in the pandemic for research universities, and that is that people have really started to understand the importance of research and science and what it means to our country. The vaccines that Dr. Hamre and Congressman Bera talked about, it's absolutely an incredible story. And what we see in front of our eyes is just the very last part of the story. And that's the great scientists at Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech who created these vaccines, and the people at the NIH. But in fact, university-based researchers were working on understanding how RNA works, understanding how messenger RNA works. And of course, these vaccines take advantage of the process that cells use to make proteins to trigger an immune response and build immunity to the virus that causes COVID-19. This is completely different from traditional vaccines that used weakened or inactivated versions or parts of the pathogen to try to stimulate the body's immune response to create antibodies. So it's an incredible thing. And that mRNA platform was out there because federally funded research at leading research universities put it out there, it was published, and scientists at Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna were able to build upon that and create the vaccines in just a very short time that are saving lives in our country and around the world. So it is absolutely an incredible story. But there are so many other examples of things that federal investments in university-based research have permitted, and that the Bayh-Dole Act has helped bring to the marketplace. The gene splicing technology that really jump-started the biotech industry, diagnostic tests for all sorts of things, including breast cancer and osteoporosis, faster and greater computing power, new internet search engines, climate-saving energy technologies. There's just so much we could talk about, but it really is a story of the United States quality of life, national security, and economy that all of this contributes to every single day.
Great, thank you so much for those comments and insights, Barbara. Let me open up to the panel for any additional comments that you'd like to share on this topic. Joe, you've seen so many impacts from the Bayh-Dole Act and those also that Barbara has just shared. What was in the mind of the legislators as they were considering taking this step of enabling universities to have those intellectual property rights that then could be licensed? Was anything like this at all envisioned?
Well, I'd like to say that we certainly envisioned it, but what's happening now is so far beyond where we were in 1980 that in 1980, we only had a handful of universities that even had a tech transfer office. And again, the government policies were so detrimental to innovation that I think that what drove us was we knew it couldn't be any worse than it was in 1980, because at that time we were losing market share to Japan. When I was at the Commerce Department, after I left the Senate Judiciary Committee, we had a classified briefing by the CIA, and they had 10 critical fields of technology. We'd already lost 3 of them. They were projecting we were going to lose the other 4 just in a matter of years. That didn't happen. As Dr. Snyder said, one of the big breakthroughs was the biotechnology revolution. If you go back to before 1980, the US was number 3 in biotech. We were behind Japan and behind Europe. We were behind Europe in drug development. Biotech came out of universities. It was so high risk that the big drug companies sort of passed on it. Who knew what it was going to be? So what happened? We started spin-off companies out of universities. And in fact, if you look at the US biotech industry, even today, it's characterized by small companies that spun off campus. So I'd like to say that we were smart enough to do that, but what we did was we went back to what the founding fathers had said, and too bad we don't listen to them anymore. Intellectual property is one of the first things in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. We recognize that we have to give incentives for people to commercialize these technologies. And we've talked about this a little bit, and God love the universities, God love the federal government for funding it. But the real heroes in our system are the companies, because no one loses a job in a university or a federal lab if an experiment fails. People do lose jobs in the private sector. Small companies do go under. So a lot of these people may not take a salary for a year. Moderna did not make a profit for 10 years working on mRNA technology. For 10 years, they made nothing. They kept working at it. Thank God they did. So, I think we recognize that we had to have those principles there. And the other thing I want to mention briefly is Bayh-Dole decentralized technology management out of Washington, out of the bureaucracy, and we entrusted it to the people who are making the technology. We thought they know more than anybody how to commercialize it. A lot of people still want to second guess them, but our system runs rings around anybody else in the world. And I would have to say that our faith in the patent system and our faith in American entrepreneurship has certainly more than paid off.
Joe, thanks for those insights. And it's just important to reflect on going back to those foundational principles for the United States, the importance of innovators and intellectual property rights to enable innovation to go forward, regardless of who's going to commercialize. And clearly, the nation's universities and research institutes create that foundation for so much value in our society and spinning off so many entrepreneurs who are willing than to take the risk because they have the opportunity of access to clear and reliable intellectual property rights. So thanks for that amplification, Joe. And so, Jillian, let me turn it back to you. Since we were talking about the importance of the biotech industry and biopharma in general, this remarkably rapid reaction and effective response to deliver ultimately these safe and effective vaccines for COVID in what we've experienced as record time, because it was able to build upon a foundation of academic research, publicly funded, as well as risk takers who saw the potential. So I'd like to ask you, how important is intellectual property then to healthcare innovation and making the investment decisions? And would you also describe for us the intellectual property and licensing landscape for COVID-19 vaccines in the United States and abroad? Jillian?
Thanks, Walt. Absolutely, I would love to do so. Before I dive into that, though, I'd like to just briefly thank Steve Susalka for raising a phrase I haven't heard in quite a long time, which is that new intellectual property being considered for in-licensing or further development might be contaminated by federal funding. In fact, that was true, and that was a big concern for venture capital and other institutional investors, and also for the big pharma who was looking at and evaluating different opportunities for nascent technologies to try and develop. I think we need to bear in mind that ultimately, our system for drug development, the whole industry, is dependent on private investment, and a key reason for that is, of course, governments are not in the business of developing and manufacturing drugs for use by their populations, certainly not in the US and Western Europe, the developed world in general. That's the business of the private sector. That being said, and thanks to Steve for the shout out on that, I'd like to turn to your question, Walt. Confronted with a novel disease and the need to urgently develop and then manufacture vaccines, biotech and pharma did rise to the challenge in early 2020. It took only about 60 days to go from learning the novel coronavirus spike protein sequence to the first proof of concept experiments. There was essentially no gap between proof of concept and entry into human clinical trials. Human trials test safety, then efficacy, and then confirm both safety and efficacy. Each trial requires a progressively larger number of people, such that each phase of trials is more expensive and takes much longer than the preceding phase. Ordinarily, this process takes years. One factor that made clinical development go so fast in the pandemic was that we were able to establish an unprecedented number of clinical trial sites, and we had a ready supply of human subjects, which often, depending on the disease, may not be the case. Recall for a moment that during the West African Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 2015, the disease naturally waned while clinical trials were ongoing, such that all but the Merck vaccine had to discontinue trials with incomplete data. That was great news for public health, but not so good for getting multiple vaccines approved for that disease. The next unprecedented challenge in the pandemic has been to stand up completely novel manufacturing facilities. To end the pandemic, the world needs at least 3 times the annual production capacity that we have now for all vaccines of all types worldwide. Manufacturing is a huge separate cost from that of carrying out clinical trials. To stand up a single new plant requires at least $130 million and 2 to 3 years of construction, testing, and qualification. The spectacular and unprecedented speed of vaccine development did not compromise scientific rigor or patient safety. Rather, it was made possible by the ability to parallel track the manufacturing effort while clinical trials were still in process. This was made possible by major upfront investments that could only be made by governments and international bodies. And given what I said a moment ago, would only be made in the context of a global pandemic. The Licensing Executive Society is well positioned to take a look inside the system for how this entire symphony of businesses and governments working together came about. It required an in-depth understanding of how IP and well-established types of legal agreements created swim lanes for innovators, licensors, licensees, suppliers, contract manufacturers, and distributors to all travel quickly and confidently toward their common goals. This was really important in a complex technology landscape, and I do have one slide to illustrate that complexity. Mary, if you would be able to show the slide, please. Thank you, Mary. Perfect. This slide comes from an excellent article that was just published in Nature Biotechnology, and it shows the mRNA patent landscape as embodied by the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines. This is a fantastic example of a biologic platform, by which is meant a plug-and-play molecular framework that can be used for many different vaccines, and indeed for many different types of therapeutics against a wide variety of diseases. This platform has been in development for over 25 years by multiple key players, as you can see here, and represents an enormous private investment. So this all just didn't happen in 2020, and it is far broader and deeper than COVID-19. The unprecedented sums invested by governments to fast-track COVID-19 vaccine development and production still pale in comparison to the decades of private investment in developing this technology. The difference is many orders of magnitude. The patent heat map here amply illustrates why it is inappropriate to take patents on the COVID-19 vaccine. It just cannot be done without a disproportionate taking of platform IP from many players. I've seen an analogy used recently about marching being like handing someone a recipe book without access to the master chef. Of course, that is insufficient to turn out a feast that is just like the one you get in the fine restaurant where the chef works. Making your own homebrewed version is not acceptable in the vaccine world because the product has to be essentially biologically indistinguishable from the original. Think about what the Marchand proponents are asking, not just a taking of IP rights, but also press ganging the chefs who created the whole platform. Tech transfer is a difficult and lengthy process, even when both the teacher and student are willing. We have seen examples already of how even willing partners can struggle. One recent example is that of Emergent Biosolutions, a contract manufacturer who mixed up a critical step for the J&J vaccine. Now think about how much more likely that scenario would be in a forced technology transfer situation. Marchand will also not address critical choke points in the supply chain, such as the availability of starting materials for the mRNA, for the specialty lipids, such as those developed by Arbutus and Acuitas, that are needed as delivery vehicles, even for the sand that's needed to make glass vials. I am glad to see that alternative proposals are now being developed, such as the Global Share program proposed by the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, the International Financing Facility that was just proposed by the IMF and the World Bank, and of course the COVAX facility set up by CEPI and Gavi. Thank you. Well, back over to you.
Thank you so much. Those are just fantastic insights. And I don't know that people really understand that complexity of licensing relationships and partnerships that are established through contract mechanisms and other types of agreements. So thank you so much, Jillian, for shedding light on that. And also that analogy of the master chef. You may have access to the recipe, but unless you understand all of the aspects of the manufacturing technology, the supply chain, and down to the glass, that is just a phenomenal situation, certainly to consider in these challenging times. And it also points to the fact that a broader set of solutions needs to be considered to the challenges of the day, while also preserving the core of U.S. innovation capacity. Let me turn it over now to Steve. There's been this huge focus on the biopharma industry, but as we've mentioned now several times, the Bayh-Dole Act applies to any technology coming out of publicly funded research in any application. The use of Bayh-Dole has now been proposed as a drug price control mechanism, but what are the types of innovations in healthcare, as well as in other fields that have been enabled by Bayh-Dole, and what, from your perspective, would be the implications of using march-in rights for innovation? Steve?
Great, thanks, Walt. Yeah, so that's a great question, and one of your initial questions is what other innovations have arisen due to the Bayh-Dole Act and the infrastructure that was developed to actually support the implementation of the Bayh-Dole Act and be able to, as Joe points out, decentralize that commercialization of inventions from the federal government to the individual locations at universities across the United States. So in terms of inventions, I could go on and on and on. Hundreds of inventions every year turn into commercial products. And so they range the gamut from food sterilization systems to new components for your HD TV, to the HPV vaccine that's available, to blight-resistant potatoes, 3D virtual colonoscopies, nicotine patches, even Lyrica, that if you have neuropathic pain, you're probably very familiar with those. All of those arose because of the Bayh-Dole Act. And in fact, they arose out of the Bayh-Dole Act because they were funded by the federal government, and that makes sense. So therefore, were covered by the Bayh-Dole Act. But I believe one of the most important aspects of the Bayh-Dole Act is it developed that critical infrastructure that was now available at universities, regardless whether that invention was funded by the federal government or not. I'll give a couple of examples. So in the beginning of the pandemic, there were many fears with a lack of PPEs being available. And in particular, one particular procedure, that of intubating a patient, was really dangerous to the medical staff around. And so what universities were able to do, because now post Bayh-Dole, with that predictability and that infrastructure that was developed, there were now tech transfer offices in hundreds of universities across the campus, as opposed to less than 24 prior to 1980. So I'll give two examples. University of Nebraska Medical Center. They developed these intubation shields that could be made very quickly and went from concept to production in a week. That is extraordinary. And the reason for that was the infrastructure was available. There was the recognition that technology transfer, protection, and commercialization is important. And there were existing relationships between those universities and the companies to go forward. Other stories elsewhere in Colombia, they developed face shields that were 3D printed and sent to New York hospitals when the pandemic was really reaching critical levels there. Again, this was done because they had the infrastructure. They had people who could do this. They had the infrastructure and the 3D equipment to develop these. They had the relationships with the manufacturers, the relationships with the hospitals. So all of that is so critical. So back to your question about implications of march-in rights. So, and again, we've talked about march-in rights, but I just want to kind of go in the Wayback Machine for a second. If you think back to 1980, when march-in rights were discussed, it was because at the time there were less than a couple dozen tech transfer offices that did licensing at all. And so there was really a fear that intellectual property funded by the federal government might lie on the shelf and never come to fruition. So again, wither on that proverbial vine. That's why certain aspects of the march-in rights were developed. It was to prevent that. In fact, when I was in tech transfer, I experienced this exact thing. We had a technology that was to help treat prostate cancer. And as part of our evaluation, we identified companies that were working on similar products. And we companies and said, hey, we've got this therapeutic we think could be effective. And in fact, we think it could be even more effective than the product that you are working on. This company was wildly interested. And there was no way they wouldn't license that intellectual property until we got down to brass tacks. And one of those brass tacks was, hey, we are licensing this to you because we want you to turn this into a commercial product. So therefore, I want to have dates, and Gillian is very familiar with milestone dates. We want to make sure that this gets to start phase 1 clinical trials by such and such date, move on and move on. This company refused. And instead they said, well, why don't we just pay you double the upfront? And we said, no, the whole purpose of us licensing is for you to turn this into a commercial product. Well, no surprise. All the company wanted to do was take what could have been the biggest threat to their product and sit that on the shelf, never to be developed further, which is the exact opposite of what we all want to do. That's really why march-in rights was developed. I think sometimes of march-in rights, kind of analogous to airbags. You have airbags in your car. You really don't want to deploy those. And so the fact that we've never deployed march-in rights is actually a good thing. That means we've been driving safely, we've been being careful. I think these are important elements when we think about march-in rights. There is a time and place for march-in rights. As Joe mentioned earlier, the actual authors of the bill have come out and said it was never meant for regulating pricing. That was the exact opposite. And in fact, there's nothing in the history of the Bayh-Dole Act legislation to even insinuate that that was the purpose. So as we go forward, I just want us to be very careful that the Bayh-Dole Act has provided countless therapies, countless products, countless services that have changed our lives for the better. And we need to be really careful that we don't misappropriate or inappropriately apply march-in rights in a manner that was never intended.
Steve, thanks so much for those tremendous insights. And it's terrific actually to see that range of learnings that have been developed over the years, the maturing of the technology transfer profession itself, and the ability to have in the various agreements for technology transfer, the expectations for appropriate development in the interests of the public, in the interests of bringing innovation into the current marketplace and to create economic value. And Joe, you must be really proud after these 40+ years to see the accomplishments from the private sector's development of academic research. And another lesson that maybe you want to talk about is the National Institutes of Health experiment, if you will, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, to apply a reasonable pricing provision in the NIH agreements. And then they abandoned that approach. So tell us more about that situation, the lessons we've learned, and any implications for the future. Especially with regard to now the discussions about imposing march-in rights for drug price control. What would that actually result in from our experiences? Joe?
Well, thank you very much. You know, it's funny because these days we hear a lot about people saying they want to be science-driven. Well, the essence of science is you run an experiment and then you learn from that experiment and go on. So let's talk about that for a second. We've actually run the experiments of the critics, and each time the door's blown off the shelves. So they've failed spectacularly. For almost 50 years before Bayh-Dole, we tried licensing federally funded inventions without strong patent protections, having them micromanaged by Washington, making sure anybody could get access to them. And what happened? Did we have a golden age of technology? No, they sat on the shelf because, as Jillian said and Steve said, you have to have the private sector to come in and take risks to turn these into real products. And without patent rights, they're simply not going to do it. as I mentioned before, under the old policies, which is exactly what people are trying to go back, the pre-Bayh-Dole policies, not a single drug had been commercialized from NIH-funded research. Now think about that for a second. Let's fast forward for today. Almost 300 drugs and vaccines out of academic inventions are in the marketplace right now, around here and around the world, fighting disease. It's also about 20 years after Bayh-Dole passed, very much like today, we had congressional pressure applied on NIH. NIH was forced to put in a reasonable pricing provision. So if you licensed an invention or if you had a cooperative agreement with NIH, you had to agree you would sell resulting products at a reasonable price. So when companies came back and said, okay, what does that mean? The answer was, we don't know. You commercialize it, and then if anybody objects to the price of it, we can then take it away from you and give it to other people. So what happened? Did we have a golden age of cheap drugs? No. What happened was people are not stupid. Companies walked away. If you look at the number of agreements with NIH, they plummeted like you fell off a shelf. What a surprise. So for 5 years, NIH had to put up with that. Finally, Director Varmus at NIH had a study done, and he came back and rescinded that policy, and he said it had achieved no public benefit. All it had done is driven companies away from important partnerships with NIH, which hurt the public interest. As soon as that was taken away, the agreements went back up again as they are today. At the same time the critics were doing that experiment, they also came up with a new idea about Bayh-Dole. They went back and invented out of whole cloth that the margin provisions allowed the government to set reasonable prices on any product, not just drugs, any product. If somebody, your neighbor, somebody abroad doesn't like the price you're charging, under their theory, you could go back and have the government say, is the price reasonable? Again, if anybody asks, what does reasonable price mean? You can't define it because it's completely arbitrary. So as soon as that theory came out, Senator Bayh-Dole immediately said, that's not how the law works. In fact, if you read the statute, the provision they're talking about only applies to universities. It doesn't even apply to the licensee. So even, you don't have to take my word for it. If you read English, just look at the statute. Every administration, Republican and Democratic, for the last 20 years has rejected that every time they file a marching petition because it's simply not sanctioned under the law. But what's happening today is we're having new pressure put on the Biden administration. There's a regulation pending, which Walt, you did a great job leading through to clarify that the Bayh-Dole would continue to be implemented as was written, to reassure companies who are getting scared now that somebody's going to pull the rug out from under them. And I'll just tell you, if the Biden administration gives into that and weakens margin rights and say that suddenly the government can start controlling prices, we're going to have our system collapse overnight. And if they do that, they better pray that we never have another pandemic. And they better pray that our economy keeps on going, because they're going to pull the props out from our economic growth, and they're going to pull the props out from our economic future. And the final thing I'll say is we're the only country in the world where 50% of our new drugs come from small companies. Most of them have either spun out of campus or funded around academic inventions. And VCs will run for the hills if it looks like the government is, after all that risk, is going to pull the rug out and give them away to our competitors, even if they're abroad. So this makes no sense. We've run the experiment. We've done it twice. Bayh-Dole works. The other way doesn't work. There's no reason at all to go back and run that experiment one more time. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that perspective. And as someone who's been both in the public and the private sectors and has had responsibilities for venture capital investment, I certainly agree, Joe, with that viewpoint, that if you have the certainty, if you have clarity in rights, it allows you and your stakeholders as in the private sector to make those tough risk-based decisions to invest or ultimately not to invest. And thanks also for mentioning the regulatory proposal that's made by NIST at the beginning of 2021. It was clearly the process of many years of effort and national conversation about the future of US innovation, the role of the Bayh-Dole and the Stevenson-Weidler Acts that were part of the NIST Green Paper. But on this regulatory proposal and also the goal to provide greater clarification, I'm wondering if the panel has any additional comments on the implications of those changes. And in particular, there's a question from our audience about, is there any need to amend the current Bayh-Dole Act? So with that, let me turn it over, perhaps, Steve, to you for any comments that you'd like to share from the perspectives of the Autumn membership and personally. Steve?
Sure, happy to. So, there are a couple of terms that kept coming up during this webinar. And so they were infrastructure and predictability. Those are the two terms. One of the most crucial aspects of the Bayh-Dole Act is it provided a uniform federal approach to commercializing federally funded intellectual property. Everybody understood the rules. We understood how it worked. The companies that work with LES and others recognized what the rules of what the rules were. The universities recognized those and were able to forge that relationship. And so I want to add a third word. So in addition to infrastructure predictability, cooperation is absolutely critical among the federal government, those academic institutions often doing the research, and the companies that then take that invention and move that forward. Those are all governed by those rules. When all of a sudden the rules are changed or interpreted differently, that actually puts the entire process in jeopardy. And as Joe said, we've tried it the other way. I recognize that everybody who has thoughts on Bayh-Dole on either side all want the same thing. And that is, we want products on the market that can actually help our society. We all want that. The question is, how do you do that? We've tried it the other way a couple times, and it hasn't worked. So I would say, in terms of these regulations, I think it's, and Autumn was very supportive of those regulations, in that they just clarify what has always been understood with those regulations. And so we are very supportive of that. And I'd say one of the things we have to be really careful about is being complacent about the Bayh-Dole Act. This is an act that if imitation is the most sincerest form of flattery, that is an act that is being imitated by countries, dozens of countries around the world. And here we are changing the rules 40 years into it, after it's shown remarkable promise. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I think it's very important to keep that predictability going forward to allow for the commercialization of those federally funded inventions going forward for the next 40 years.
Thanks so much, Steve. And the clarification that's intended in the regulation that is out also enhances the compliance function that's so important for public transparency, and in addition to providing that focus on maintaining the integrity of the Bayh-Dole Act for future predictability. And so thank you, Steve, for those comments, also those that Autumn and so many other organizations have submitted. Just before we close, we have another question from the audience, and let me address these to Jillian. And I'll combine these next couple of questions. Considering the network of patents and licenses, do you consider that vaccine production could be increased through compulsory licensing? And also to any of our panelists, in the case of Norvir in 2004, NIH denied the petition for March-in rights on the basis that it does not concern itself with drug pricing. Should NIH in some cases be made to utilize March-in rights to regulate drug pricing in order to prevent capitalizing on citizens who need those high-cost drugs to survive? So let me turn it over, Jillian, to you for those comments.
Thanks, Walt. Let me try to disentangle those a little bit. And I appreciate the questions and that they've come in from the audience. Thank you to the audience members who asked them. Let me start with the network of patents and licenses that we showed on the slide, and whether the infrastructure for vaccine production could be increased through compulsory licensing in view of that fearsome network of relationships. Thank you. I think the short answer is No. And I think the reason for that really is if you look at the way that compulsory licenses work, the patent holder is still entitled to a reasonable royalty, and rightly so, even if a compulsory license is granted. The government can't simply eminent domain property that it has granted in terms of a patent with no compensation to the rights holder, and that doesn't even get to the issue of the underlying know-how and trade secrets and all of the expertise that is hard won and hard gained that goes into making vaccines work. If you think about this, and bearing in mind that the government is constrained by something called the Anti-Deficiency Act, the government is not able to enter into sort of an open-ended, if you will, commitment to compensate the patent holders and the rights holders. It is constrained by how much it has available in terms of appropriated funds that could be used for that purpose in any given year. What that means is if you compare that to the enormous commercial value, not only of direct sales of COVID-19 related pandemic countermeasures, but also if you bear in mind the huge impairment in value that would come from giving away large parts of how the platform itself works, and therefore the lost ability to mount a competitively viable new commercial product using that platform. You've essentially destroyed trillions of dollars of value, and on behalf of an entity that is the government that is never going to be able to provide adequate compensation. For the issue of whether NIH should be the body to set definitions of what is a reasonably priced drug. Let me just say first, in response to this, there's no thought given to what the price of a drug should be at the beginning of the 7 to 20 plus years of drug development. Pricing is actually a decision that's taken rather late in the course of development. So many questions have to be answered first. So much risk has to be addressed and reduced first before you even get to that. That truly, what Joe had to say earlier. It's an arbitrary surprise gotcha. And there's no guidance anywhere in the statutory framework as to what reasonable means when it comes to the price of any specific drug. So by definition, without guidance, it's all an arbitrary kind of a Wild West scenario, and we just can't tolerate that. And the community of investors and major pharmas who develop drugs now, they won't stand for that. And there's no good alternative. I know people are saying, well, why does it have to be a for-profit drug developer? Sadly, the way our society has developed, this is a private sector enterprise. There is no real alternative to private industry for developing and rolling out those drugs. I think if we want to answer questions which are rightly raised of whether drugs are appropriately priced and accessible to US citizens, we really should be looking elsewhere to try to answer those questions.
Gillian, thanks so much. And thanks also for sharing earlier about the global partnerships for vaccine supply, distribution, and the application of licensing agreements to amplify the amount of product supply available. So we're right at the end of our time now, and I'd just like to thank our panel and ask each of you, beginning with Barbara, to provide some commentary just very briefly in these exciting times of the change to a new administration in the US, the views that we have been talking about today, the important role that intellectual property and the Bayh-Dole Act are playing for innovation in the economy. What recommendations might you share with America's leaders and policymakers? Barbara?
Ooh, don't kill the goose that laid the golden egg and keeps laying the golden egg year after year after year. I think we have a system that's the envy of the world. Can it be made better? Yes. I think, continued investment in the research enterprise is what's needed. And we just saw the payoff from that hugely in the case of the vaccine development for the mRNA vaccines, at least. And I do want to note that using margin rights to control drug prices would not actually be a really effective tool, because there are drugs developed that do not come out of university-based research and that are not federally funded. And that would do absolutely nothing in those cases. So it would be a very ineffective way to do it. But I think making sure that the continued investment in competitiveness, that would be my advice for policymakers.
Thanks so much. And Steve, let me turn it over to you next. What insights would you share?
That's a hard act to follow, because that don't kill the golden goose, that really summarizes it very well. Really, let's not be complacent. The Bayh-Dole Act has gotten us to where we are today because of the predictability and infrastructure that's been developed. The next pandemic is around the corner. We need to be prepared. And we do not want to cut ourselves off at the knees with a lack of infrastructure or clear rules and a strong functioning Bayh-Dole Act.
Thank you, Steve. Joe, over to you.
Well, again, yeah, everything people said before. I mean, just think about it. We're roaring back from the worst pandemic in 100 years. Our economy's coming back. It's because our public and private sector partnerships work. Of all the problems we've got in Washington, this is not one you need to fix. There's a lot of other things you need to work on, but the most sincere form of flattery imitation is flattery. And I'll say the Chinese are copying Bayh-Dole. So they're pretty damn pragmatic. So I would say leave our system alone. It works. Go off and solve other problems. As Barbara said, we had to look at the kind of funding we need now to compete with China in the future. But if you undo our public and private sector partnerships, God help us, because we're going to be in trouble with our health, and we're going to be in trouble with our economy, and it's going to be a self-inflicted wound. There's no reason to do it. The data's out there. Just read it and listen to it and go on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. And Jillian, last word, please.
Oh, thank you. I note there's one final question from the audience on what are Autumn and LES doing to engage with those calling for the use of margin rights in Congress. I would just like to address that quickly, that LES and Autumn as well have been active in speaking up for the integrity of the system in the public policy arena, and we will continue to do so. The Biden administration is doing so many things right, from involving science in key decisions in policy making to investing in innovation. We would like to encourage them to do more of that. And the exercise of margin rights and patent waivers are sadly not that.
Thanks, Jillian. I'd like to thank our wonderful panel today on behalf of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Dr. John Hamre, the CEO, and thank you again to Congressman Bera for your timely and wise opening remarks. Thank you all for a very stimulating conversation and for illuminating this important issue of U.S. innovation, the role of the Bayh-Dole Act, and intellectual property rights for our future. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.